Hi, welcome back guys, this is your friend, Deku fanfic with another fiction. What if Deku journey to drageria? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku's breath hitched in his throat at the sight. The creature that stood, or rather floated, before him was not as horrific as he thought at second glance. Sure, it was big and gave a sense of dread that permeated the area. But it was mostly just a pile of wings with many eyes. There seemed to be 6 in total. 2 were covering its upper torso and face, folded twice around like they had many segments or no bones at all. The next 2 covered the lower torso and legs, again wrapped twice around. Then the last 2 stay unfurled behind its back, where they were used to keep its body aloft the ground. Its eyes were many and dotted all the wings inside and outside. They were all the size of regular human eyes, but each one was colored every conceivable color imaginable. The eyes weren't looking in one particular direction and seemed to be looking all around. At the crowd of people, at Izuku and Ire. If anything, the creature looked more weird than terrifying. What seems to be the problem? The creature asked again. Its ancient voice shaking the ground whatever you vowel it pronounced, and all of its eyes seemingly trailed onto Izuku for an answer. Izuku managed to catch his voice again and stammered out, "Iri, she, please help," he begged. Suddenly, the creature's wings began to twitch and unraveled from around itself. After unwrapping its wings twice, the form underneath is what reignited the fear Izuku had felt so strongly before. Izuku had always heard of biblically accurate angels, but he never thought he'd actually see what that meant. The creature was huge for one. It had a human-like silhouette with skin black as night, and dotted with white sparks that looked like stars. It had no mouth, ears, or nose, but had 2 large white orbs for eyes. It had 2 large horns that sprouted from both sides of its temples and followed the path of its head, where they sloped outwards like the front of a crown. It also had several smaller horns, really giving off the empirical crown vibe. It had eyes all over its body, just like the wings, except they weren't randomly placed. Instead, they were in 3 sets of large circles. 1 ring of eyes going around the front of its head, with the 2 white ones making it up, and another 2 that interlock with the first on both sides of its body, giving it the appearance of having 3 faces. Speaking of its body, not only did it have a human-like appearance, it also had 3 long arms with 6 clawed fingers, 2 legs that shimmered out into smoke at the knee, and totally nude with no visible genitals. The creature looked down at Ere and reached out one of its 6 arms. Just when it was about to touch her, Ere must have noticed, even though her eyes were shut, and backed away while screaming, "No!" A look of concern, compassion, and pity rose on the being's eyes as it looked down on the frightened girl. He carefully coerced the young girl into some trust with his words and voice, telling her in a sweet voice for such an ancient-sounding being, "Be not afraid, little one. You have nothing to fear, for yourself or others. There is no possible way for you to harm me. In fact, I will help you. Will you not trust me to help you?" Iri stood still, laying on the ground trying to cover her horn and exposed skin. But eventually she stopped struggling and inching away and allowed the huge being to get close to her. The being carefully picked her up with 2 of his arms and then immersed her in the other 4. It seems to be hugging Ere, prevalent by how its eyes closed and its head leaned on top of hers. But soon that was discovered to not be the case. A strange white light emerged from the being's body, a light that almost seemed to be eating at the red light being emitted from Ere. Eventually, both lights mixed in such a way that it caused a blinding effect. Everyone looked away until the light show died down. When it did, Iri was still being carefully held in the being's 6 arms. Only the red energy around her was gone, and her horn was no bigger than a bump on her head. The purple were amazed and ecstatic at this, many of which were whispering, quite loudly, about this show of power from the being. "There now? All better," said the being as it opened all its eyes. "You have nothing to be afraid of, little one," it told her as it stroked her hair with one of its arms. But Eri still refused to open her eyes. Now then, the being said in a much more serious tone, making everyone go silent. What happened to cause such a conundrum to summon me? Deciding to take the proverbial fall, Izuku spoke up through his fear and elation. As he replied, Eri got scared by a man she thought was someone else, and her quirk activated on its own. I don't think she can control it. The creature looked down at Izuku, making him shiver under its gaze as it asked, and what exactly spooked her so much? Izuku swallowed hard and answered, there was a man in the crowd who she thought was the bad man with the bird mask. Was it? And no, just some guy with a beak for a mouth. The being then placed a different hand on the softly sobbing child's head, and its eyes, along with Eri's, began to glow a bright white. After a second, the light died down after a second, and a look of compassion strung across the featureless face of the creature as it said to Eri, "Oh, my dear child, you have nothing to fear. The man you saw is not the one you think. He and the rest of his associates are not in this country. That much I can promise. Not everyone that looks like a bird is not related to that man. And you shouldn't be so quick to judge. They have no control over the way they look." Eri sniffled back a few times before weakly saying, as a sorry. A small yet light chuckle came from the being as it said, "It's quite all right, my dear. We all make mistakes, and there's no shame in that. Fear is a very terrible thing if it's all we know, but you can't let it control you. You must be able to use it to help you thrive and not merely survive. Do you understand?" I guess," Eri replied. She then opened her eyes and looked up from the being's shoulder and took in the sight of his inhuman appearance. She was scared stiff for the entire time she looked at him. But the being caressed her hair and said, "Be not afraid, little one, for I am a friend to all." "Are you friends with Izuku?" Eri finally spoke up after several more seconds of intense staring. The being gave a jovial laugh and replied, "I did say friend to all, did I not? So yes, I am a friend of Izuku." The being then looked back at Izuku and asked, "Is that not your name?" Izuku just wordlessly nodded. Seeing his and Eri's continued reaction, it sighs and says, "Perhaps this form is too much for you to handle, or will never understand some key things." With that, the being began to transform before their eyes. First it got smaller, much smaller. Then its extra limbs began to recede into its body, and from there its legs became corporal, and its many horns vanished until there were only the main two. The many eyes on its wings and body closed and vanished as its skin went from midnight black to a more natural fair skin color. More human-like features appeared on its face like shape, nose, ears, mouth, hair, and so forth. Then clothing appeared on its quickly developing body. A long black imperial suit with long fan-like tail coat. Black boots and pants appeared with accents of gold, and a red sash that wrapped around its neck and splayed across its hips. The only thing that stayed from its previous form was the many white star-like spots on its exposed skin, giving it the appearance of many freckles. In the end, what stood before them was not an eldritch being of untold power, but instead a man in his mid-20s with short black hair, a pale complexion, 6 wings, 2 horns, and eyes that seemed to hold every color of the rainbow, with an innumerable amount of freckles covered every part of his exposed skin. The only part of him that remained inhuman were his hands. They were not only large, but pitch black and still had claws while still having 5 fingers. Even Izuku had to admit that this man before him was extremely beautiful. "There? Is that better?" the man asked with the softest and warmest smile, looking at the girl with his multicolored eyes. After a moment of staring, Eri held the man's face in her small hands and stated, "You're not so scary." The man gave a jovial chuckle and replied, "No, I guess I'm not." Izuku couldn't even begin to know what to say, especially after everything that just happened. So he asked one of the easiest questions on the planet. "Who are you?" Suddenly a man with blue hair and an imperial outfit, like something of a fantasy politician, emerged from behind the winged man and immediately began to angrily tell Izuku off. Who is he? How dare you ask such a demeaning question before him, you ignorant fool? This is the great and powerful dark god of this land, Lord Ta. Before he could continue with his rant, the winged man grabbed the blue-haired man's lips between his fingers. The winged man sighed exasperated and said to the shorter blue-haired man, he is new here, Deskin. Of course he doesn't know who I am. Not everyone who comes here knows me and my 100 or so titles that you don't need to list off. And there is no need for you to explode on him or anyone else who asks such a question. The blue-haired man defeated in defeat, and the winged man snaked his lips like a cartoon. He looked back to Izuku after rolling his eyes and said to him, sorry about Deskin. He tends to get quite defensive about my self-proclaimed honor. My name is Tachibana, the head of power and king of this country. Pleasure to meet you, young one. Tachibana introduced himself. Realizing the utter importance of the man, Izuku went into a bow and greeted him back. Oh, nice meeting you too, sir. Your lordship. Now on to business. Izuku, Tachibana said to him with a more serious tone, making Izuku stand up with butt cheeks clenched in stress. What exactly is your sister's quirk? Izuku shuffled uncomfortably in his spot as he admitted, well, she's not really my sister. Tachibana blinked a few times, making it seem like this bit of info was unimportant, and said back a bit more forcefully, we'll address that later. What is her quirk? Izuku gulped and collected his scattered thoughts while replying, she said it was called rewind. But I'm not sure what it does. Do you have any ideas or clues? Tachibana promoted him further. Izuku just pointed to a pile of logs and explained, when she hit that wooden chair it just turned into logs. Logs? Tachibana repeats the word. Arit. Examine it, please. He said aloud as a tall older woman with silver hair steps from behind him. She too is wearing an imperial fantasy outfit that makes her look like a fantasy secretary, with heels, a pencil skirt, and a cape with a brooch on her breast. Only she has a fair bit of her bountiful cleavage on display. Izuku did his best not to stare as the women bent down and examined the logs while putting some glasses on. After a few minutes of examination, the woman, Arit, looked to Tachibana and reported her findings. It seems that the chair wasn't just turned back into logs, but the nails remained unchanged. There are still signs or deformation due to improper building and rust due to water. I believe her quirk affects only living material, turning back to its original state or reducing back to an older form. She explained while holding up a bent and rusting nail in comparison to a log that looked freshly cut. That would explain why you were so intent on not letting anyone touch you, Tachibana said to Eri, who tried to hide her face on his shoulder. But you didn't get hurt by my curse, Eri stated in a small voice. Curse? Tachibana questioned her. I believe that's what she's been told her quirk is, Arid explained from the side. Tachibana looked at her with concerned compassion as he said, my dear, your curse is no curse at all. What you've been told is a lie. A quirk is no more dangerous than a knife or gun, only threatening in the hands of those who intend to do harm. And I can see you have no intentions of harm. Eri looked up sadly and fearfully from his shoulder, and without looking him in the eyes, she replied, But, I always hurt people. Tachibana waved his hand at the assumption and stated, you simply lack control. Controlling a quirk is no different than learning how to walk or climb a tree. With practice, you'll master it. How come you didn't disappear when my curse? Eri began to ask until Tachibana corrected her. Quirk. Turned on, Eri finished her thought without correcting herself. Deskin came from the side again and said to the girl in a demeaning way, well, that is a simple question for a small-brained child. The great and powerful Lord Tachibana, creator of. But he was cut short as Tachibana snagged his lips between his fingers. I'm an immortal sweetheart. I'm a constant. which means I can never change unless I do so myself. Like when you saw me shaft between my forms. Tachibana explained briefly. So you have nothing to fear if you do lose control again. Eri smiled with watery eyes up at the man, who then addressed Izuku saying, now on to the second point of business. You said this girl is not related to you. Care to elaborate? I didn't steal her or anything. I mean, I kinda did. But it was for a good reason, I swear. Izuku fumbled over his words, trying to spit out an explanation while panicking. Go on, Tachibana prompted him further. Izuku calmed down a bit, collected his thoughts, and explained. When I heard your offer, I found her while trying to find a detour. She said she needed help from the bad man with the bird mask. And I couldn't just leave her or take her to the authorities, since I would have missed my chance to leave or the authorities would be under this person's thumb. So I took her with me. I'm sorry, he said while looking at the ground. Tachibana gave a slight chuckle and stated, you have nothing to apologize for. Boy, we all make mistakes, especially in a desperate hour. Though what you did might not have been the best option. Considering it was a form of kidnapping, it was valiant. And to be honest, it seemed like the best option. Does that mean you'll kick me out? Izuku looked down at the ground, knowing fully well how to read between the lines when someone was going to say something else. Tachibana looked down at the disheartened boy with confusion as he replied, whatever for. This made Izuku raise his head in surprise. In foresight, you may have not done everything correctly or justly, but in foresight you did save this young girl's life. You should feel proud of that at least. He told him while placing Eri into his arms. Izuku looked between Eri and Tachibana before saying with a choked-up voice, I thank you. Tachibana waved his hand and replied, no need for it. All are welcome here no matter who you are. Lord Tachibana, you are still holding Deskin's mouth, Arit told him. Tachibana looked to his side and saw the blue-haired man still standing there patiently with his lips sealed between his fingers. He immediately let go while saying, whoops, sorry. Deskin simply bowed in reply, almost seeming happy about it. Now that that's settled, I'll have to take you both with me, Tachibana stated matter-of-factly. What? Almost everyone shouted aloud. Arit cleared her throat and told him, Lord Tachibana, perhaps you should explain further. You sound like you're going to abduct them. Oh, hey, my mistake. Tachibana's sweat dropped at the realization and awkwardly laughed as he said, what I meant was I'll have to take the both of you to live in my home. What? Everyone practically shouted again. Lord Tachibana, you can't be serious. They are peasants. You can't dirty your estate and image by taking in. Deskin tried to persuade him until his lips were grabbed once more. Let me finish, Tachibana exclaimed with a dangerously firm tone, making everyone go silent. I simply can't let Eri live amongst the common folk with no supervision. With the state and threat of her quirk, she could create a disaster, and I can't always be there when it does get out of hand. In my home, she and others will be kept safe since it is large and primarily made of inorganic material, and she will receive guidance on how to control her ability. Despite its danger, with proper training, she could become a top-notch healer with no equal, he explained. Really? Eri looked up at him hopefully. Tachibana pulled Deskin's lips back and replied with a warm smile. Really. And what of the boy, my lord? Arit asked him. Well, obviously, he will be coming too, Tachibana stated. Izuku looked at him with an expression of fear and shock as he stated nervously. Really? I wouldn't want to intrude. I get the fact Eri could have hurt someone, and it does sound like she'll be taken care of and helped with her quirk. And you'd just abandon her to someone you respect out of previous fear. Tachibana obviously jostled him, making Izuku clam up and tense up. Tachibana laughs and says, I only jest, young man. But on a serious note, I know you and her, despite your short time together, have formed a strong bond. You wouldn't want to break that. And I see Eri doesn't want to break it either. he stated as Izuku looked down to see Eri with a death grip on his uniform jacket. Izuku didn't say anything, so he just hugged Eri into his body, while Takabana exclaimed, "It's settled." He then looked to Deskin and asked, "What are we looking at for our new population numbers?" He looked over to the huge group of people staring at him, and then said, "I never expected to get this many. Right now, we've already accounted for over 500 with many more still unaccounted for. We could be looking at 1,000 already. That's not even counting the dozen or so new orphans," Deskin informed him. Takibana rubbed his hands anxiously as he stated, "And our orphanage is already under reconstruction to expand." Damn. Cherry. How are we looking at new home infrastructure? Arit took a clipboard out from a satchel she was caring for and flipped through several pages before saying, "Though, although many citizens from the main town have moved to the newly built docks, we still have many homes under renovation and construction from the older models. So we only have enough for a dozen or so available." He rubbed his chin and asked, "What about sections 2-5? What is the status of their completion?" Arit flipped through her clipboard again and replied, "Even though the workers are trying tirelessly to complete the new section to expand the town, they are still not suited for human civilization due to the unhealthy and dangerous work areas. We're still looking at a week or more." Takibana tightened his hands into fists at this revelation and stated, "Damn. But we'll have to put these people somewhere. What about that field we just opened on the west side of town? It's been marked off for more cropland, but nothing has been done yet," Arit told him. Takabana nodded his head and told her, "Stop any and all production to the construction of that plot. Set up tents and provide provisions for the newcomers." Takabana then looked at the crowd of people still staring at him, and he opened his 6 wings as he exclaimed in a loud voice, "People of Japan, my name is Takabana, Dark God of Drageria. It pains me to say this, but we weren't expecting such a great influx of new people, and we don't have enough housing for all of you. However, construction is underway and workers are exceeding production to see this through. I know you all have traveled far from where you were, left much behind, and are tired. But I only ask for your patience, and soon you will be properly housed. For now, we will have temporary living arrangements and the opportunity for you to take jobs. Again, I'm sorry for the inconvenience," he told them while bowing deeply. "You have no need to apologize, Lord Takabana," a voice from the crowd called out. All heads looked around for the person, but the crowd was too thick to see the origin of the voice. The voice then spoke again, saying loudly, "You have already given us more than our previous society was willing to. I used to live in the back alleys for years after losing my job, but now knowing I'll have a roof over my head and steady employment means more than I can put into words. Waiting just that much longer after such a long time of hardship means nothing. If anything, we should thank you," said the voice as an audible sound of them bowing deeply on the ground. Before he knew it, nearly everyone in the crowd and back of the tent had taken to bowing deeply before the Dark God and giving their thanks to him. Some even weep before him in their thanks. The whole tent was soon swallowed up by the mumbling thanks and soft sobs of people. Takabana couldn't help but smile at this and stated with a serious tone, "If you do wish to thank me and live here, then there's one thing you must do." All the people looked up from the ground and stared at the god, waiting for his demands. "Cast aside your previous citizenship, bow to me, and swear your loyalty to Drageria." Within minutes, all the people were bowing again and swearing their loyalty in a mass low muttering mumble that echoed through the tent like a wave. Takabana smiled proudly at this and stepped forward while raising his hand into the air. "Then by taking this vow of loyalty, through the power vested in me, I now make you all citizens of Drageria." With that, a strange light emitted from his hands and spread out into multiple beams that cascaded around the whole inside and outside of the tent. Each one of the beams touched a person, and their bodies glowed for a short time before dying down and the beams disappearing. The beams of light vanished as quick as they came and returned back to Tachibana. All the people arose with a new sensation in their bodies. Even Izuku could feel it after getting up from his kneeling bow. It was almost like he had a sense of belonging. Like this place, although completely alien and strange, now felt like home. It was nice. Now that that's over with, let's get you two to my home and get you settled in, Tachibana stated happily, while addressing Izuku and Eri. He started to walk off with Eri and Duskin at his sides with several of the guards tailing them. Noticing that he wasn't following, Tachibana turned around and prompted them with a friendly, "Well, come on." Izuku hesitantly took a step forward before looking back at his new acquaintances and said, "Goodbye, you guys. I really hope we'll see each other again soon." "Yeah," Shinso said excitedly, while rubbing his head and looking away. "Me too," Kirishima exclaimed boldly. "Take care, Midoriya-kun." Momo gave a slight and polite bow to him. Izuku was then escorted out of the tent while following Tachibana by his tail. Izuku idly wondered if he did have a tail. Seeming to know what he was thinning, Tachibana looked back at him and placed a clawed finger up to his lips. Once they were in the main part of town, Izuku was forcefully pushed by the guard into Tachibana's wings. When he looked back, he was shocked that the guard was trying to hold back a huge horde of townsfolk who were trying to get close to Tachibana. All shouting his name and praising him, Izuku practically stayed glued to the god's back, clutching his free hand to one of his wings anxiously. Tachibana smiled and waved back at the crowd of screaming people trying to push their way in. Eventually, they were escorted to a horse-drawn carriage that wasn't really being pulled by horses. They did look like horses, sorta, but they seemed to be crossed with some kind of scaly reptile with a large set of bat-like wings. Izuku was helped up by one of the guards, and the door was closed behind him. Inside there were 2 rows of seats placed on both halves of the coach, which were red and extremely soft-looking. Tachibana was sitting on the front half with Arit and Deskin sitting on both sides of him. Izuku finally sat down and nearly melted into the seat. It was so soft and comfortable that it was like a memory foam mattress. He almost wanted to fall asleep right there, but kept himself awake as the carriage jutted forward, and he placed Eri on the spot next to him. After several minutes of silence, Izuku finally broke the silence by asking, "So, where are we going?" Tachibana chuckled and answered, "To my home, of course, silly boy. You must have been through a lot if you ask so many repeated questions." I'm very sorry. It's been a long 2 days." Izuku apologized while bowing in his seat. "Where exactly is your home?" Izuku asked awkwardly. But instead of Tachibana answering his question, he got Deskin and his angry tone half yelling at him, "Are you daft and stupid? Can you not see the castle built into the mountain that the village is at the base of?" Izuku looked out the window and saw that they were climbing up a gently sloping incline that led up to the huge mountain that upon closer inspection was made into a castle. His attention was drawn back into the coach as he heard an audible smack. He looked back and saw Arit with her hand across her body and Deskin holding the back of his head. "Don't be rude to him, Deskin. He's obviously been through much," Arit scolded him like a child. Deskin growled and leaned over while yelling in her face, "Don't hit me, you silver-haired harlot." At this point, Tachibana was already at his end with the 2 of them, considering they were yelling at each other by leaning over him. He half yelled with an angry tone, "Both of you be quiet." The 2 of them sat back in their seats with their heads down as they apologized to him quietly. "Yes, Lord Tachibana. Sorry, Lord Tachibana." Tachibana, and addressing Izuku, he said, "As Deskin said, my home is the castle built straight into the race of that mountain we are traveling to." Izuku looked up at the castle and wondered why someone like him would even want something so big and loud and in your face. He assumed someone like him would live amongst the common folk. I bet you're wondering why someone as seemingly humble, honorable, and not totalitarian as myself would have such an outlandish, loud, and extravagant castle especially built into the face of a mountain. Tachibana addressed him with a smile. Shock struck across Izuku's face as he saw the man perfectly guess what he was thinking, and tried to ask, "How did you?" But Tachibana said, "I have many skills. But to answer your question, I am the head of power in this place for one, and it is a testament to that power I possess. But also its use to house me and my family." He explained further to him. Family? Izuku repeated the phrase. He didn't even know there was a queen or goddess in Tachibana. He never even thought of it, or the fact he might actually have some kind of linkage under his name. He wondered what they were like, and what quirks they had like their father. Tachibana nods happily and says back, "Yes, family. More specifically, my 6 children. You'll meet them very soon. I hope you get along as well as I can expect." As they continued in silence, listening to the coach master call commands to the horse-like animals, Izuku realized that the silence was completely unnerving, especially with Resin giving him the stink eye the whole time. Tachibana, seeming to know what he was thinking, smacked the blue-haired man over his head and told him to stop, which he did, much to Izuku's relief. Still, the silence was super uncomfortable, so he decided to make small talk and ask some burning questions in his mind. Excuse me. Izuku weakly piped up, getting the dark god's attention. I was wondering Lord Tachibana." Tachibana waved his hand at him, making the boy stop and listened intently as he said, "There's no need for formalities when we are in private, Izuku. So long as you live under my roof, you can drop the Lord part. But in public or during my office hours, you must refer to me by my title." Izuku nodded, and then looked between Arit and Deskin before asking, "Even when they are around?" "Yes, especially when these two or a certain other number of my second hands are present," Tachibana told him before looking at both people sitting at the sides and firmly stated, "Is this clear between you two?" "Yes, Lord Tachibana," Arit replied with smooth elegance. "Yes, Lord Tachibana," Deskin replied begrudgingly through grit teeth. The dark god looked back at Izuku and asked, "Now then, what was that question you wanted to ask me?" Izuku, realizing he was being referred to, jumped as he said, "Oh, I'm sorry if this sounds rude, but are you human?" Deskin opened his mouth to say something nasty and degrading, but Tachibana quickly snapped his lips closed as he answered, "Yes, despite my looks and abilities you've witnessed so far, I am indeed 100% human. Though it's all connected to my quirk, which I'm sure you are going to ask me about next." Izuku nodded and Tachibana explained, "My quirk is actually very simple, and yet very dangerous. Kinda like Ares. It is called Soul Eater, and it does exactly what you think. I can remove the soul from any complex living organism and eat them. So animals and humans exclusively. Though there was one time I took the soul from a plant, but that was something entirely different. And there's a funny story that's tied to my quirk, but I'll tell you that later," he said with a wink. "What do the souls provide for you?" Izuku asked, trying to hide the anxiety in his throat. Tachibana rubbed his chin and replied, "Well, it's just a nutrition supplement. I could never have to eat or drink if I had a steady supply of souls, though I don't need to anyway. But the secondary part is what I gain from the body of the soul." Izuku tilted his head with airy at the vague statement and listened to the man explain. "When I eat a soul, let's say a horse, there's a guaranteed chance that I'll be able to gain the property of that horse. Higher stamina, greater strength, faster speed, extra height and weight. There's also a stacking effect. So if I continue to eat the souls of horses, I can eventually gain all attributes at full power." Tachibana finished off. Izuku really didn't want to ask this next question. Really didn't want to. He probably already knew the answer considering the power he possessed, and what he's seen done with it this far. The thought alone made him tremble, but his quirk analysis bug was poking him harder than ever. So he begrudgingly asked, while trying to hide the disgust in his voice, What about when you eat a soul from a person that has a quirk? Tachibana snapped his fingers, pointed at him, and stated boldly, I was just about to get to that. When that happens, I gain an attribute of that person's quirk. So if I ate the soul of someone with a healing quirk, I wouldn't have their quirk's full power. If anything, I'd just be able to heal my own wound slightly faster than normal. But if I continue that trend, I'd gain a healing quirk so strong that I'll be able to heal a severed limb. He trailed her off while leaning over and brushing his hand over Izuku's face while saying, or anyone else's wounds. Izuku instinctually touched his face and took note that his black eye and cheek welt were gone, much to his amazement and Tachibana's amusement. The dark god then changed the subject, asking him, speaking of which, mind telling me about how you got your injuries? Izuku stopped touching his face and fidgeted uncomfortably in his seat, looking out the window as he replied, I'd rather not say. Tachibana waved his hand and said in a serious and understanding tone, That's fine, there's no pressure. I hope one day you trust me enough to tell me such a story. I hope so too, Izuku said under his breath. Tachibana looked over at Irie, who was gazing out the window, and asked, And I'm guessing that the bad man with the bird mask gave you your injuries. Irie looked at him panicked, before deflating and nudging herself into Izuku's side silently. Getting his answer, the dark god said to her, Well, like I said before, you won't have to worry about him being here. You're safe now. Izuku looked down at Irie, then back at Tachibana before asking, Can you know? He asked while motioning to Irie's many scars. Tachibana shook his head and replied, Even with my great power, I'm afraid I can't. Fresh injuries are one thing, but scar tissue is another. That would require a more finite procedure that I'm sure Irie will not want to do while awake. He looked at the girl who was burrowing her face into Izuku's rib cage. Suddenly, the carriage jutted to a sharp halt, and Izuku and Irie were thrown into the three people in front of them. The three people were thrown back and slammed their heads into the back of the carriage. Izuku and Irie fell on all three of them, and Tachibana's wings flew out and got tangled in both Deskin and Irie. Tachibana pushed one of his own wings away from his face and said, while spitting out a black feather, Well, that was unpleasant. After the five of them managed to untangle themselves from one another, Deskin ripped open the carriage door and yelled at the coach master, What's the big idea? Why'd you stop like that? The coach master took off his hat, placed it over his chest, and apologetically explained, Forgive me, Master Deskin, but a piece of the mountain has broken off and blocked the path to the castle. I'll get it, Tachibana said quickly while raising a hand out towards the huge rock. Within a moment, a strange energy surrounded it, along with his hand, and in a split second it turned into sand. Tachibana let the sand fall over the edge, only to hear the surprised cries of several other guards underneath. Tachibana looked over the edge while sucking in air through his teeth and taking an uncomfortable and tense posture at his handiwork. He then quickly called out from the top, Sorry about that. It's okay, Lord Tachibana. We're fine. One of the guards called from the bottom, with a groan in his voice. They are definitely not fine. Tachibana sighed at himself while getting back into the carriage and slapping his head. Without looking to his side, he said, Arit, get the names of those guards and give them the week off with a little extra on their next payment. Yes, Lord Tachibana, she replied while taking out the clipboard and writing it down. The carriage moved again, and things went back into silence with the only sound coming from Arit writing. Tachibana leaned back in his seat with a clear look of shame on him while trying to play it off cool. At this point, Izuku really started to question if this guy really was a dark god, let alone a god. Especially for something as scatterbrained as what he did. After a bit of silence, Tachibana decided to break the ice and asked, I see you have something else on your mind, Izuku. He wasn't wrong. He definitely did have some more questions. And it would sure be a nice distraction from Tachibana's previous muck-up. Yes, I do, Tachibana-san. What's going to happen to those people? Will they be all right? He asked the dark god. Tachibana smiled and told him, they'll be fine, I can assure you. Although they'll need to spend a week in tents, they have new houses and jobs chosen provided for them. His statement made Izuku falter in his expression. He then asked with a sad and anxious tone, chosen? So they won't even get to be what they want? Seeing what Izuku was thinking, Tachibana reassured him by explaining further. Perhaps I should explain further. You see, the people will have an option to choose a job they want. But we insist they take one that best suits the use of their quirk. Even if we don't have a job a person wants, we can still give them something similar until a position does arise. We are still a developing country, Izuku, and we need to utilize our resources and people's skills as much as possible. It's not that they don't have a choice. We just want to use them to better develop the country further and let it prosper. Izuku digested all this information for a moment before saying to the dark god with an apology tone, that makes sense. I'm sorry, I assume. Tachibana waved it off and replied, it's all right. I can't deny your previous mentally of your society in comparison to mine. But rest assured that everyone has a choice. Izuku nodded and looked out the window with embarrassment and shame still stinging his chest. On that topic, Tachibana referred to Izuku as the boy perked his head back up. You'll have to get a job or go into schooling. While I don't mind you living in my home due to your relationship with Irie, everyone here in Drageria is required to pitch into society in some way or form, if they are able-bodied or old enough. I hope you understand. The dark god asked him. Izuku nodded in agreement and replied, of course. A growing country needs everyone to do something, and so will I. If I can have some time to rest. Tachibana nods vigorously and says back with full confidence, of course, of course. You've been through a lot, the two of you. When you feel ready, I'll help you get into whatever you desire. Izuku waited for a moment before he worked up the courage to ask, are there any jobs for heroes? Tachibana, who was staring out the window, shot his head in his direction, along with the other two people present, and exclaimed with a laugh, heroes. Ah ha 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 ha. Oh, don't be silly, boy. We have no need for heroes here. Not much happens in the way of crime. We don't even have a prison because of how peaceful things are here. Tachibana saw how Izuku deflated in sadness at his statement, so he restructured himself and said, however, my royal guard is similar to being a hero. Sure, you won't be flamboyantly saving people, beating bad guys, and saving the day like some romanticized comic book. But you are still able to help the little person in need. Whether it's lifting a box or breaking up a fight or stopping a potential crime, you'll still be doing good, just not in the way you envisioned it. He explained to him. Izuku's eyes gleamed with joy and excitement, something Tachibana was glad to see, and the young teen said, that sounds wonderful, but, Tachibana questioned him as Izuku trailed off. I'm quirkless. Izuku finally forced himself to say. There was silence in the carriage for a few minutes, as all three people went from staring at one another to staring at Izuku, who had his head down in shame. Eventually, it was Deskin who finally spoke up and said, well, that's a stupid reason. He then put his hand up defensively, while shooting his head in the direction of Aerith. The silver-haired woman rolled her eyes and said to him, I'm not going to slap you, Deskin. In fact, I agree with you, in the context rather than the form. She then cleared her throat, and with her eyes closed, she gives a small lecture like some sort of teacher, explaining, being quirkless is not an inhibiting factor in Drageria. If you're able and willing to do something, then the only thing that can stop you is yourself and common sense logic. Thank you, Aerith. I couldn't have said it better myself, Tachibana exclaimed while puffing out his wings, accidentally hitting both people next to him. After closing them, he added his 2 cents saying, she is right, Izuku. Here in Drageria, we don't judge someone by the nature of their quirk, but by the color of their character. Izuku looked like a computer buff, as he heard each word trickle from the god's mouth like some golden nectar. Hearing every word like it truly came from a higher being of greater divine knowledge. Absorbing and digesting every last bit like it was a lifeline. Here before him, this so-called God was telling him all the things he ever wanted to hear in his life. And then he asked through the begging of tears, "So, you mean I?" Tachibana, yet again knowing what he was thinking, cut him off and stated boldly, "Yes, Izuku, you can absolutely be a hero, even without a quirk." At that moment he couldn't hold it back. He fell into his hand and began to cry tears of joy for the first time. He sobbed louder and harder than he ever had before, much to Ari's dismay. Immediately after he started, she also started to cry. Izuku scooped up Iri into his lap and hugged her while rocking her back and forth, as tears continued to fall. He could even bring himself to comfort her with his words, as he just kept crying with her. "Royal Guard," Arit corrected him. Tachibana's pointed ears perked up, and he quickly tried to catch himself and said with an obvious stuttering panic, "Right, yes, Royal Guard. What did I say?" Arit narrowed her eyes at him, which only made him sweat. Knowing Tachibana for most of her life, she knew when he meant something else. He was always easy to read, and he hasn't meant to mix up those words. He had a reason, and that reason was connected to this kid. She wanted to know more, but settled on just staring at him judgingly. Tachibana managed to get himself out of that situation as the carriage came to a stop, and he excitedly exclaimed, "Ah, we're here." Tachibana exited the carriage so fast that he tripped and landed on his face. He pulled himself up, shook himself, and tensely helped the still crying Izuku and Eri off with an obviously forced smile, much to Arit's disavowment. Tachibana then tried to play it off, as he turned to the coach master and said, "Thanks for the ride, Cappy." Cappy tipped his hat and replied, "Any time, Lord Tachibana." At this point, Izuku and Ari had managed to calm down enough to take in their soundings. In front of them was a large stone platform that stretched several dozen yards in all directions before going off to several paths that lead down the mountain, all of which were different. The stone platform was connected to the face of an entrance that vaguely looked like a castle keep gate and doorway, though it was all made of stone. Around the perimeter were guards about every 10 feet or so, all clad in a mix of armor and regular uniform clothes. Tachibana stood before the entrance and exclaimed excitedly, while spreading his arms and wings out, "Here we are, you two. Welcome to my home." Izuku and Eri looked around at the blankness of the stony structure. Its dotted window opening, its standing guards, and its doorway that was only 12 ft tall for such a large front area. "It sure is, Izuku tried to find any good descriptive words. "Boring," Eri added bluntly. Izuku scolded her, while feeling dread crawling down his spine. Tachibana laughed in a booming tone and said, "Ah ha ha ha. No, no, no. She's absolutely right. The outside is boring and stony. It's the inside where the real sights are," he said with a wink, while waving up to the top of the stony structure where a man above saw him. "Lord Tachibana has returned. Open the door," the man called out clearly enough to be heard by Izuku and Eri at the bottom. A few moments later, and the door seemed to start opening all by itself. It was so large and heavy that it took long enough for it to open just enough for a person to walk through. Deskin and Eri went in ahead, while Tachibana stood back with Izuku and Eri. Just before he entered, he turned to the two children and said to them, "I must warn you though, the inside may surprise and overstimulate you a bit. Just let me know if either of you feel a bit jarred." Tachibana entered the castle, leaving a mostly confused Izuku and Eri outside. They both looked at each other, shrugged, and Izuku walked in with Eri on his hip. Izuku immediately took notice of the bright light coming from within the castle doorway and almost hesitated, but knew that Tachibana was waiting for them and didn't want to be rude, so he forced himself to move in. Once he did, the two kids had to cover their eyes from the shift of light, And when their eyes adjusted to the inside, both their jaws hung to the ground in shock and awe of what they saw.